Indian people are people with pre-constitutional existence. As tribal nations have these government-to-government relationships with the US, and that means that they're nations. So, and the American Indians are the only people in the country that can say that they are nations, within a nation. We often hear that term, and not ethnic minorities. Yes, they are, people of an ethnic minority kind of background or status, but as nations, this is a very different kind of political status. And so it's this political distinction with this political relationship to the state, which, other groups as citizens in the US don't have. And as such, as nations within the state, we are subject to an entirely separate body of law that frames our existence. Within that body of law, the US has what's called a trust responsibility to tribes. This is affirmed in federal law over and over and over again. It's one of the founding doctrines of federal Indian law. And so it means that the federal government has a responsibility of some would argue, and this is really getting into the weeds now, but some argue a fiduciary responsibility to tribes. This stems from the fact that and this is part of the paternalistic relationship that we have with the federal government, that we don't even own our own lands. We don't own titles to our own lands. The federal government has imposed this system of title, European system of land titles. And, early on with the Supreme Court decisions, they have said that, we are, as Native people, are incapable of owning titles in the European style to our own lands. And early on, they constructed this relationship of like a guardianship. So the US has imagined itself as being the guardians of Native people. And this is, of course, early 19th century logic. But it's never been repudiated. It's never been overturned. This is still the foundation of federal Indian law with Native people. Like, they are our trustees in this, quote unquote, ward to guardian relationship. That has never changed. Well, it's evolved in some ways. There's authority and power that's been invested in tribal nations, but fundamentally the structure has not changed. And this is why we say it's still a system of inequality. Well, no, that's not even the right word. A system of authority, of unconsenting authority over our lands and who we are as people. And then as nations, as people that are nations in this relationship to the US, but as people with very particular identities, land and tribe are always central for Native people before US subjectivity or citizenship. And so that's really the fundamental difference. When we talk about this concept of equality in the US, it's always about, the brass ring is being more fully incorporated into the state, in these civil rights frameworks. But for Native people, it's not that simple. It's really more about, needing to retain our connections to place and to land, which is what defines who we are ultimately. And so and to compare, like, civil rights is, again, this striving for equality for people of color. Again, this, concept, people of color. Vine Deloria, the so-called father of American Indian Studies, who we all look up to, and we base so much of our work on, wrote in 1968 during the height of the civil rights movement. He wrote this book called Custer died for your sins, an Indian manifesto. And he set out to talk about, why there are all these differences for American Indians compared to, well, there was a whole chapter on this, and he comparing what American Indian people were fighting for compared to like the black community and the Black Panthers and and Martin Luther King and these various iterations of civil rights. And he said in that book, he said that the concept of equality came to mean sameness, and that Black people and other ethnic minority people would be considered as the same, like is fundamentally not different than white people, and that for Native people this was really not what we were striving for. We wanted to maintain this, what Robert Williams Jr., the legal scholar, Native legal scholar, says, this measured degree of separateness. So, and this is about, one of the things that Deloria said also in that chapter was, he said, what we really need is a national leave us alone policy, because for Native people, the problem has always been the meddling in all of our affairs. And so this is what, Williams means by this measured degree of separateness. We want our sovereignty, we want the authority to deal with who we are and to be in relationship with the US, but not to be controlled by it. And so this is about the concept of sovereignty. So sovereignty for Native people is really more important than inclusion or equality. That's not to say that Native people don't want to be perceived as being equally intelligent or equally capable or equally, fundamentally able to operate in the world. So there's different ways to define these terms, but this is really, the equality, it's equity in terms of, of being seen as equals in terms of sovereignty and about our ability to manage our own affairs. And so but there's a paradox here. There's a paradox, and the paradox is in needing to also, while we are being swept into our subjectivity as US citizens, we are still subjected to representation in Congress. And so given the fact that we are represented by congressional representatives, then we have to reserve the right to be able to freely choose those representatives. So elections are really important, but hopefully you can see the paradox here about leave us alone, but we still need the right to have fair elections and to be fairly represented. Okay, so coming to this concept of diversity, equity, and equity and inclusion, this is a work, of course, I'm deeply involved in right now. This term BIPOC is really problematic. We're all probably familiar with it right now. Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's come to sort of stand in for the ethnic minority communities, and but for American Indian, it's really not accurate to lump us into that. I'm pretty sure the term BIPOC was not invented by a Native person, but I really don't know. So I guess it's probably not the case. It's not a great way to refer to us. And the reason is that it inadvertently erases or perpetuates the erasure of us by subsuming us into multiculturalism, which is just another form of assimilation. So if we're seen as just another group of people of color, it doesn't maintain the political distinctions that are circumscribed by our relationships of sovereignty to the state. And it reinforces a racial analysis, right? It reinforces the racializing of us as people, and that is really, really highly problematic. And I don't have time to get into why that is, other than to say that there are long-standing contestations. In fact, it's in the Supreme Court right now. Conservative religious groups have been attacking our sovereignty for some time. They would like to see tribal sovereignty be abolished, and they are using the concept of race to do that. And so it's really like talking about Native people as a racial group is really, it's just problematic, and it's much more accurate to think about us in terms of these political relationships as political groups. And this is my last slide, and I wanted to talk about, it's like, well, what does this all mean? What does equity mean for American Indian and Alaska Native peoples? Well, we can understand that the US, this trust responsibility, this legal principle and legal foundation is one mechanism for the equitable distribution of resources. Because, if we think of equity in terms of the distribution of resources, then the US trust responsibility is one way of that happening. But the problem is that even in this foundation, resources are seldom equitable. I mean, resources like education and housing and healthcare, these budgets that are and these responsibilities that the US has affirmed decade after decade, they're never enough. I mean, the amount of money that's given to us to maintain our education systems, and you can see in the education disparities that those are all a direct result of the chronic underfunding of these systems, and also the problems of housing in Indian communities. And healthcare is the same thing. The federal government has, affirmed over and over again its responsibility to provide healthcare for us. That's a treaty responsibility. It was in many of the treaties, as was education. But the money that's allocated for these things is always way below than what is actually needed, and typically below what the federal allocations for all other Americans are. So it maintains these disparities, this lack of funding. And tribes are then forced to meet these shortfalls themselves if they have the ability to, or to go without. Now, in places like Southern California, like especially San Diego, where there are several successful gaming tribes, they can meet those shortfalls. They can fund these kinds of functions of their government. But this is the context of San Diego and Southern California, with the kind of wealth that gets generated, is very far outside the norm compared to the national situation. Most tribes, even gaming tribes, do not generate the kind of wealth that we see here in California. And so they do little more than provide jobs for community members. But in the best case scenarios, the tribes can meet these shortfalls because of their economic development. We can talk about equity in other realms. Like just this week, I gave a talk a couple of days ago to a group called Navigating the New Arctic. So it was a conference for Arctic studies and researchers on the topic of research equity. And so, for example, I talked about, what research equity means in that context, in the context of, doing research. And there's a lot of ways to talk about that. But so research is one realm. Representation, what does equity and representation look like? And that's also a very broad kind of category. And what about his, correctives of history? How are Native peoples written about in our historical